Jason Statham sat in his trailer on the set of his latest action movie, scrolling through emails on his phone. Among dozens of messages from publicists and agents, one caught his eye: an invitation to appear as a guest on Late Night with Carson Blake. The name alone was enough to make anyone pause. Carson Blake wasn't just any talk show host. He was infamous for his razor-sharp tongue and ability to push even the biggest celebrities out of their comfort zones. Some called him hilarious, others labeled him rude, but no one could deny that his interviews were must-watch TV. Jason leaned back in his chair, tapping the screen thoughtfully. He'd been asked to promote his new film, a high-octane thriller filled with car chases, explosions, and plenty of hand-to-hand combat scenes, but this particular appearance felt different. Everyone knew what Carson Blake was capable of. His shows often teetered between entertaining banter and outright ambushes. Jason's agent had warned him too. Carson loves playing mind games. Be ready. But Jason wasn't like most actors. He didn't shy away from challenges. If anything, he thrived under pressure. It was part of why audiences loved him so much. Whether it was taking down bad guys on screen or facing tough questions off screen, Jason approached every situation with confidence and grit. Still, there was something about Carson Blake that gave him pause. This wasn't going to be your average late-night chat. The email explained the details: live audience, pre-recorded sketches, and a segment where Jason would answer fan questions. It all sounded routine until Jason scrolled further down. There was a note at the bottom reminding guests to expect the unexpected during the interview. That phrase stood out like a flashing neon sign. Was Carson planning something? Probably. Did Jason care? Not really. In fact, he found himself intrigued by the idea of matching wits with someone who prided himself on being unpredictable. As he closed his laptop, Jason decided to accept the invitation. After all, he'd faced far worse than a sarcastic talk show host. Growing up in England, working odd jobs before finding success as an actor, and navigating Hollywood's cutthroat industry had taught him resilience. And besides, Jason had always believed in calling things as they were. If Carson wanted to play games, fine. But Jason wasn't about to let anyone walk all over him. Not on live television, not anywhere. Over the next few days, Jason's team sent over research materials about Carson's hosting style. They highlighted past episodes where the comedian mocked A-list stars, poked fun at their personal lives, and sometimes even reduced them to awkward silence. Jason skimmed through the clips without flinching. Sure, Carson had a knack for stirring drama, but Jason noticed something else. Most of his targets either laughed along nervously or tried to ignore the jabs altogether. No one seemed willing to stand up to him directly. That realization sparked an idea in Jason's mind. What if instead of dodging Carson's punches, he confronted them head-on? Not aggressively, but firmly, with clarity. Jason smiled to himself as he imagined the scene. He envisioned staying cool under pressure, using his trademark blend of charm and wit to turn the tables on Carson. It wouldn't just be entertaining. It might also send a message about respect and boundaries. By the time filming wrapped for the day, Jason had made up his mind. He texted his agent, "Tell them I'm in." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "And tell them I don't do rehearsals." Whatever Carson Blake had planned, Jason would handle it his way, with honesty, humor, and zero tolerance for nonsense. Little did he know, this decision would lead to one of the most unforgettable nights in late-night television history. The evening of the talk show arrived, and backstage at the studio, the atmosphere buzzed with a mix of excitement and unease. Jason Statham stood near the curtain, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit while glancing occasionally at the monitor showing the live audience settling into their seats. The energy in the room was electric, but there was an underlying tension that even someone as composed as Jason couldn't ignore. A young production assistant approached him nervously, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Statham, we're about 5 minutes out," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She handed him a bottle of water and offered a polite smile before hurrying off to check on something else. Jason took a sip, his sharp eyes scanning the bustling activity around him. Crew members rushed back and forth, adjusting lights, testing microphones, and ensuring everything was perfect for the live broadcast. Despite the chaos, Jason remained calm, exuding the same quiet confidence that made him a global icon. As he waited, another figure appeared. This time, it was one of the senior producers. The man looked harried, clutching a stack of papers and speaking rapidly into a headset. He paused when he saw Jason and gave a forced grin. "Hey, Mr. Statham," he began, stepping closer. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Carson's, well, he's planning to keep things lively tonight." Jason raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Lively?" he repeated, his tone neutral but curious. The producer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, you know how he is. Likes to push buttons, get reactions. Just be prepared, okay? We don't want any surprises." Jason nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Thanks for the tip," he replied, his voice steady. "But I think I'll manage." The producer seemed unsure whether to take that as reassurance or defiance, but he didn't press further. Instead, he muttered something about checking on Carson and disappeared into the fray. Standing alone again, Jason let out a low chuckle. Push buttons, huh? That sounded like Carson Blake all right, but Jason wasn't worried. In fact, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. If Carson thought he could rattle him with cheap shots or awkward questions, he was about to learn otherwise. Jason had faced tougher opponents than a smug talk show host, both on screen and in real life, and he'd always come out on top. From the other side of the stage, Carson Blake emerged from his dressing room, already in full character. Dressed in an expensive suit and sporting his signature slicked back hair, he greeted crew members with exaggerated enthusiasm. His laugh echoed loudly through the hallway, though it carried a hint of arrogance that grated on those who knew him well. As he passed by Jason, he stopped briefly, offering a quick handshake and a rehearsed smile. "Looking forward to our chat, Jason," Carson said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Should be fun." Jason met his gaze evenly, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Oh, I'm sure it will be," he responded, his words laced with subtle steel. Carson blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected edge in Jason's reply, but quickly recovered with a laugh. "Great, see you out there," he said, clapping Jason on the shoulder before striding away. As Carson disappeared onto the set, Jason turned back to the monitor. The audience was now fully seated, cheering wildly as the warm-up comedian worked them into a frenzy. Laughter filled the air, punctuated by applause and whistles. Jason watched silently, taking it all in. He knew what was coming next. The bright lights, the noise, the pressure, but none of it fazed him. This wasn't his first rodeo, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. Backstage grew quieter as the countdown began. A stage manager signaled for Jason to get into position. He stepped up to the edge of the curtain, listening as Carson delivered his opening monologue. The host's jokes landed well with the crowd, eliciting roars of laughter. Yet beneath the surface charm, Jason detected the calculated precision of a performer who thrived on control. It was clear Carson intended to dominate the conversation tonight. When the stage manager gave the cue, Jason took a deep breath and walked out onto the set. The audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet as he made his way to the guest chair. Jason waved casually, flashing his trademark half-smile as he settled in. For now, the spotlight belonged to Carson, but Jason knew better than anyone that the game wasn't over until the final move, and he had no intention of letting Carson steal the show without putting up a fight. The interview began innocently enough, with Carson Blake leaning back in his chair, flashing his trademark grin as he introduced Jason to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a man who needs no introduction. Jason Statham," he announced, gesturing dramatically toward his guest. The crowd erupted into applause once again, cheering as Jason gave a polite nod of acknowledgement. For the first few minutes, Carson kept things light, asking predictable questions about Jason's latest movie. "So Jason," Carson started, his tone upbeat but slightly exaggerated, "your new film is packed with action, as always. Tell us, what makes this one different from all the others?" It was a softball question, designed to ease both Jason and the audience into the conversation. Jason responded with his usual charm, explaining how the story had personal meaning for him and how he'd worked closely with the director to bring authenticity to his role. The audience listened intently, clearly enjoying the insight. But then, just as Jason finished answering, Carson shifted gears. His smile widened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know, Jason," he said, tilting his head playfully, "people often joke that you only play one character, just with a different name each time. What do you say to that?" The comment hung in the air for a moment, met with scattered laughter from the audience. Some viewers chuckled nervously, unsure if Carson was joking or crossing a line. Others sat quietly, waiting to see how Jason would respond. On the surface, Carson's tone was teasing, almost friendly, but there was an unmistakable edge to his words. He wasn't just making conversation, he was testing the waters, trying to see if he could rattle Jason early on. Jason didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his expression calm but focused. "Well," he began, his voice steady and measured, "I suppose if people are having fun with it, that's fine. But I think what matters most is whether the characters resonate with audiences. If they're entertained and invested, then I've done my job." His response was smooth, deflecting Carson's jab without rising to the bait. The audience clapped politely, appreciating Jason's professionalism. Carson, however, wasn't ready to let it go. Sensing an opening, he pressed further. "Fair point," he said, nodding as if agreeing, but then added with a smirk, "Though I have to ask, isn't it exhausting playing the same tough guy over and over again? Don't you ever get tired of being, well, you?" This time, the audience reaction was mixed. A few laughed hesitantly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Carson's question felt less like playful banter and more like a deliberate dig. Jason's jaw tightened ever so slightly, though his demeanor remained composed. He tilted his head, studying Carson for a brief second before replying. "Not really," he said evenly. "I enjoy bringing something unique to every role. And honestly, I think variety comes from how you approach the material, not just the roles themselves." His answer was diplomatic yet firm, leaving little room for argument. Carson blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Jason's poise. For someone known for throwing curveballs, Carson seemed surprised that his first attempt hadn't landed quite as expected. Still, he wasn't about to back down. Leaning forward conspiratorially, he shot back with another quip. "Interesting perspective. But come on, you must admit, after so many years, don't you worry about getting typecast?" Jason's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes narrowed slightly. There was no mistaking the challenge now. Carson was pushing harder, probing for weaknesses. But instead of reacting impulsively, Jason chose his next words carefully. "Typecasting happens when actors stop evolving," he replied, his voice carrying a subtle weight. "I prefer to focus on growth, not labels." The audience murmured approvingly, sensing the tension simmering beneath the surface. While Carson's questions grew increasingly pointed, Jason's responses remained cool and calculated. Each retort showcased not only his wit, but also his refusal to be drawn into unnecessary conflict. Yet even as Jason maintained control, it was clear that Carson wasn't done. This was only the beginning, and everyone watching knew it. Carson Blake leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk as if deep in thought. His grin was still plastered across his face, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Jason's calm, measured responses had deflected every jab so far, leaving Carson scrambling to regain the upper hand. The host wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. It was supposed to be him steering the conversation, not the other way around. Well, Carson said, drawing out the words with exaggerated flair. "It seems like you've got all the answers tonight, Jason." He chuckled, though it sounded forced, almost brittle. "But let's talk about something else for a moment, shall we? You've been in this business for decades now. What's it like knowing that younger actors are coming up behind you, faster, stronger, maybe even better?" The audience gasped audibly at the thinly veiled insult. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Carson's tone was light, almost jokey, but the underlying message was clear. He was targeting Jason's age and relevance in an industry obsessed with youth. It was a cheap shot, the kind of comment designed to provoke a reaction. Or worse, humiliation. Jason didn't blink. His expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He sat up straighter, his shoulders squared, as if bracing himself for what was coming next. For a brief moment, he simply stared at Carson, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uneasy. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he spoke. "Younger actors," Jason repeated, his voice smooth and steady. "Of course, they're talented. I'm not blind to that. But talent isn't about age. It's about experience and dedication. And trust me, those two things don't fade overnight." The crowd erupted into applause, clearly siding with Jason. They could sense the tension building, and they admired how effortlessly he handled Carson's provocations. Carson, however, looked momentarily flustered. He hadn't expected such a composed rebuttal, especially one that subtly called out his own lack of depth. Undeterred, Carson pressed on, determined to break through Jason's armor. "Fair enough," he said, leaning forward again, his voice dripping with Fox sincerity. "But come on, Jason, let's get real here. Hollywood can be brutal, especially for action stars. Don't you ever worry about staying relevant in an era where CGI does half the work for you?" This time, the audience didn't laugh. Instead, a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Carson's question felt less like playful teasing and more like a calculated attack. Even some members of the crew exchanged worried glances. They knew this was crossing into dangerous territory. Jason took a deep breath, his piercing gaze locking onto Carson's. There was no trace of amusement in his eyes now, only quiet intensity. "Relevance," he began, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "isn't defined by trends or technology. It's about staying true to who you are and delivering your best, no matter the circumstances. If anything, I'd say the challenge keeps me sharp." His words hung in the air, met with thunderous applause from the audience. People were on their feet now, clapping and cheering, as if sensing that Jason had turned the tide. Carson, meanwhile, seemed rattled. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a fleeting look of uncertainty. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Jason added softly, "And honestly, Carson, if relying on CGI is the future of action movies, then I'll happily stick to doing things the old-fashioned way." The audience roared with approval, their cheers echoing through the studio. Carson forced a laugh, trying to play off the moment as harmless banter, but it was obvious he'd underestimated his opponent. Jason hadn't raised his voice or lost his temper. He didn't need to. Every word he spoke carried weight, precision, and undeniable truth. For the first time in the interview, Carson appeared genuinely shaken. He glanced at the teleprompter, searching for a lifeline, but found none. The script he'd planned, the carefully crafted insults and quips, had fallen flat against Jason's unshakable composure. What was supposed to be a lighthearted segment had become something entirely different, a masterclass in grace under pressure. As the applause died down, Carson attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking about Jason's upcoming projects. But the damage was done. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. Jason Statham had taken control of the narrative, and everyone watching knew it. The interview had reached a tipping point, and the atmosphere in the studio was electric. Carson Blake tried to pivot back to safer topics, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud waiting to burst. He glanced at Jason, who sat calmly in his chair, exuding an aura of quiet authority. The audience, still buzzing from Jason's previous remarks, seemed to be holding its collective breath, anticipating what would happen next. Carson cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. All right, he said with forced cheerfulness, waving a hand dismissively. Let's switch gears for a moment. Tell me, Jason, how do you balance your demanding career with your personal life? You've got a family now, right? It was meant to sound casual, even friendly, but there was a sharpness to Carson's tone that betrayed his true intent. This wasn't just small talk, it was another dig, carefully disguised as curiosity. By bringing up Jason's family, Carson was venturing into deeply personal territory, hoping to catch him off guard or provoke an emotional reaction. Jason froze for half a second, not out of surprise, but because Carson had finally crossed a line. Up until now, the insults had been superficial, targeting his profession and public persona. But this was different. Family was sacred to Jason, and everyone knew it. The audience leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Instead of lashing out or showing anger, Jason took a slow, deliberate breath. His eyes locked onto Carson's, unwavering and steely. For the first time that night, his voice carried an edge, not loud or aggressive, but firm enough to silence the room instantly. You know, Carson, Jason began, his words measured and deliberate. I came here tonight to share my work and have some fun. I didn't expect to sit through cheap shots and thinly veiled insults. And frankly, bringing my family into this. That's not just disrespectful, it's unnecessary. The studio went completely silent. Even the crew members standing behind the cameras exchanged stunned looks. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights overhead. Carson's smile faltered, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to interrupt but couldn't find the words. Jason continued, his tone calm but unyielding. I respect your job as a host, and I understand the need to entertain. But there's a difference between humor and cruelty. If you're going to mock someone's livelihood, their age, or their family, then maybe you should ask yourself why you feel the need to tear others down to boost your own ego. The audience erupted into applause before Jason even finished speaking. People were on their feet again, clapping wildly, some even shouting encouragement. It was clear they were rooting for Jason, admiring the way he stood up to Carson without losing his composure. Even the band, which usually played background music during commercial breaks, joined in hesitantly, adding to the overwhelming support. Carson, however, looked visibly shaken. His confident demeanor crumbled under the weight of Jason's words. He stammered for a moment, trying to recover. Hey, come on now, he said, laughing nervously. We're just having a little fun here, right? No harm meant. But Jason wasn't buying it. He leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze never leaving Carson's face. Fun stops being fun when it disrespects people, he replied, his voice low but commanding. And trust me, Carson, I've dealt with bullies far worse than you. So let's leave it at that, shall we? The audience cheered louder than ever, their applause reverberating through the studio like thunder. Carson sank back into his chair, looking smaller somehow, as if Jason's words had stripped away his bravado. He fumbled for a response, eventually settling on a weak joke about moving on to lighter topics. But the damage was done. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly, and everyone in the room knew it. As the audience settled back into their seats, still buzzing with excitement, Jason sat calmly, his expression unreadable. He hadn't raised his voice or resorted to theatrics. He didn't need to. With a few carefully chosen sentences, he had dismantled Carson's entire act, exposing the insecurity beneath the smug exterior. For the remainder of the interview, Carson struggled to regain his footing, stumbling over questions and avoiding eye contact. Jason, meanwhile, remained composed and gracious, answering politely but firmly whenever prompted. The audience hung on every word, captivated not by the spectacle of conflict, but by the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be disrespected. By the time the segment ended, it was clear. Jason Statham had not only won the battle, he had rewritten the rules of engagement entirely. With the tension still hanging thick in the air, Jason Statham didn't let up. Carson Blake's attempt to brush off the moment as just fun had fallen flat, and now the audience was fully on Jason's side. Sensing that he had the upper hand, Jason pressed forward, not with anger, but with razor-sharp precision. It was time to dismantle Carson's facade once and for all. "You know," Jason continued, his voice calm yet commanding, "a lot of people in your position use humor as a shield. They hide behind jokes because they're afraid to be vulnerable or real. But here's the thing. When you make someone else the punchline, just to get a laugh, it says more about you than it does about them." Carson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual bravado crumbling under Jason's steady gaze. The host tried to interject with another nervous chuckle, but Jason held up a hand, silencing him without saying a word. The gesture spoke volumes. This wasn't over. "I've been around long enough to recognize insecurity when I see it," Jason added, leaning forward slightly. His tone wasn't harsh. It was almost conversational, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "You push buttons and throw jabs because you think it makes you look clever, but what it really shows is that you don't have much substance to offer. And the audience deserves better than that." The crowd erupted again, this time with even louder cheers and applause. Some people stood up, clapping so hard their hands turned red. Others shouted words of encouragement like, "You tell him." And that's right. The energy in the studio was electric, fueled by the realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jason wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up for everyone who'd ever felt belittled or dismissed by someone trying too hard to prove themselves. Carson, meanwhile, looked utterly deflated. His trademark smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression of discomfort and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, he seemed genuinely lost for words. Instead, he fiddled awkwardly with the pen on his desk, avoiding eye contact with both Jason and the audience. Seizing the moment, Jason softened his tone slightly, delivering the final blow with grace rather than malice. "Look, Carson," he said, "I'm not here to tear you down. I'm just asking for mutual respect. If we can agree on that, then maybe we can actually have a conversation worth watching." The audience roared in approval, their applause echoing through the studio like a tidal wave. Even some of the crew members couldn't resist joining in, clapping discreetly from behind the cameras. It was clear that Jason had struck a chord, not just with the live audience, but with anyone tuning in at home. His message was universal. Respect matters, and nobody should tolerate being disrespected, no matter how famous or powerful the other person might be. Carson finally managed to croak out a response, though it lacked any trace of his earlier confidence. Yeah, okay, fair point," he muttered, forcing a weak smile. "Let's, move on to something lighter, shall we?" But the shift in dynamics was undeniable. From that moment on, Carson was reduced to a shadow of his former self. His questions became hesitant and disjointed, lacking the sharpness that had defined his hosting style. He avoided making further jabs, clearly unwilling to risk another confrontation. Meanwhile, Jason remained composed and gracious, answering politely while maintaining an air of quiet authority. As the interview wrapped up, Carson attempted one last desperate bid to salvage his reputation. "Well, folks, that was intense," he joked lamely, earning only scattered laughter from the audience. "But hey, that's what makes live TV exciting, right?" Give it up one more time for Jason Statham. The applause that followed was deafening, though it was obvious who the real star of the night was. Jason rose from his chair, shaking Carson's hand briefly before turning to the audience. With a warm smile, he thanked them for their support, adding a humble nod of appreciation. As he walked off stage, the cheers continued, lingering long after he disappeared behind the curtain. Backstage, Jason exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. He hadn't come into the show looking for a fight, but he'd stood his ground when it mattered most. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone of the importance of integrity and respect. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Jason Statham had left an indelible mark on late-night television history. As the credits rolled and the live audience began to file out of the studio, the aftermath of Jason Statham's confrontation with Carson Blake quickly became the talk of the town. Backstage, Jason was met by his team, who couldn't contain their excitement. "That was incredible," one of them exclaimed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You completely owned that moment." Jason shrugged modestly, grabbing a bottle of water from a nearby table. "I didn't go there looking for trouble," he said, taking a sip. "But when someone disrespects you, or worse, your family, you've got to stand your ground. It's not about ego. It's about principle." His words resonated deeply, not just with his team, but also with millions of viewers watching at home. Clips of the interview had already started circulating online, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Within hours, hashtags like #RespectForJason and #CarsonGetsSchooled were trending worldwide. Fans praised Jason for his composure, wit, and unwavering dignity, calling it one of the most satisfying moments in late-night television history. Meanwhile, Carson Blake retreated to his dressing room, visibly shaken. Gone was the cocky grin and self-assured swagger that usually accompanied him offstage. Instead, he sat slumped in front of his mirror, staring at his reflection as if seeing himself for the first time. The weight of what had happened, and how poorly he'd handled it, was sinking in. His attempts to play it off as harmless banter during the closing segment had fallen flat. And now the internet was ablaze with criticism. By morning, opinion pieces dissecting the incident flooded newspapers and entertainment blogs. Some commentators defended Carson, arguing that his style of humor was simply part of the job description for a provocative talk show host. Others, however, sided firmly with Jason, pointing out that there was a clear difference between edgy comedy and outright disrespect. Many noted that Carson's behavior revealed more about his insecurities than his wit, while Jason's calm yet assertive response showcased true strength of character. The backlash wasn't limited to online discourse. Advertisers who regularly partnered with Carson's show began reconsidering their involvement, concerned about being associated with controversy. One major brand even issued a statement saying they would pause their partnership until further notice. Behind the scenes, executives from the network scrambled to mitigate the damage, holding emergency meetings to discuss whether changes needed to be made to the show's format, or even its host. For Jason, life returned to normal almost immediately. He flew back to London the next day, where he resumed working on his upcoming projects without missing a beat. When asked about the interview during later appearances, he kept his responses brief and diplomatic. "It is what it is," he told reporters with a shrug. "I don't hold grudges. I just hope people take away the importance of treating others with respect." Despite his nonchalant attitude, fans continued to celebrate him as a hero. Social media lit up with memes depicting Jason as a modern-day knight defending honor against a smug dragon, Carson. Late-night comedians joked about the incident, with many imitating Jason's signature blend of calm authority. Even some of Hollywood's biggest stars chimed in, expressing admiration for how Jason handled the situation. As for Carson, the days following the interview were humbling. Ratings for his show dipped slightly, and public sentiment toward him soured. While he tried to bounce back with lighthearted jokes during subsequent episodes, the spark seemed to have dimmed. Critics noted that his once bold hosting style now felt cautious, almost hesitant, as if he was second-guessing every word before it left his mouth. In the end, the confrontation between Jason Statham and Carson Blake served as a powerful reminder of the fine line between humor and cruelty. For Jason, it reinforced his reputation as a man of integrity and poise. For Carson, it was a wake-up call, a moment that forced him to confront the consequences of his actions. And for everyone watching, it was proof that sometimes standing up for yourself can leave a lasting impact far beyond the stage. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Jason Statham's unforgettable appearance on Late Night with Carson Blake continued to spread. Clips from the interview dominated social media feeds, news outlets, and even late-night talk shows hosted by Carson's competitors. Comedians and commentators couldn't resist weighing in, often mimicking Jason's calm yet cutting delivery or poking fun at Carson's visible discomfort. It became one of those rare cultural moments that transcended entertainment, sparking conversations about respect, boundaries, and accountability in the public eye. For Jason, life carried on much as it always had. He returned to his work, training for fight scenes, reviewing scripts, and spending time with his family, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the world hadn't forgotten. Fans stopped him on the street more frequently than ever before, not just to praise his films, but to thank him for standing up to Carson. "You inspired me," one fan told him during a chance encounter outside a London cafe. "I've been letting people walk all over me, but after watching you, I realized I don't have to take that anymore." Jason smiled warmly, offering a simple nod of acknowledgement. "We all deserve respect," he replied. "Just remember, it's not about being loud or aggressive. Sometimes staying calm and speaking your truth is enough." His words resonated deeply with the fan, who later shared the story online, adding to the growing chorus of admiration for Jason. Meanwhile, Carson Blake found himself navigating uncharted territory. Once celebrated as the king of edgy humor, he now faced mounting criticism for his hosting style. Viewership numbers dipped slightly, and advertisers grew wary of associating their brands with controversy. The network executives called an emergency meeting to discuss potential changes to the show's format, hinting that Carson might need to tone down his antics or risk losing his spot altogether. Carson, however, wasn't ready to give up without a fight. In a surprising move, he addressed the backlash head-on during the next episode of his show. Sitting alone on stage under dimmed lights, he opened the segment with an uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability. "Listen," he began, rubbing his temples as if gathering his thoughts. "What happened last week with Jason? Well, I messed up. Plain and simple. I crossed a line, and I owe him, and all of you, an apology." The audience fell silent, unsure how to react. Apologies weren't Carson's usual style. Sarcasm and bravado were his trademarks. But this time, there was no smirk, no clever quip to soften the blow. Just raw honesty. "I got too caught up in trying to entertain," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters, treating people with kindness and respect. Jason handled himself with class, and I didn't. For that, I'm truly sorry." The studio erupted into applause, though it was softer and more reflective than the raucous cheers Carson typically elicited. Social media lit up once again, this time debating whether his apology was genuine or simply a calculated attempt to salvage his career. Some praised him for owning his mistakes, while others remained skeptical, accusing him of damage control rather than sincere remorse. Regardless of intent, the apology marked a turning point, not just for Carson, but for the broader conversation about behavior in the entertainment industry. Journalists and critics seized on the moment, writing think pieces about redemption and the importance of holding public figures accountable. Meanwhile, Jason responded to Carson's apology with characteristic grace. During a press conference promoting his new film, a reporter asked what he thought about Carson's statement. Jason paused briefly, then answered, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is learning from them. If Carson means what he said, then good for him." The exchange between the two men, first the confrontation, then the apology, became a defining chapter in both their careers. For Jason, it solidified his status as not just an action star, but a role model for integrity and resilience. For Carson, it served as a humbling lesson that pushed him to rethink his approach to comedy and hosting. As the dust settled, audiences reflected on the incident with a mix of admiration and introspection. Jason's quiet strength reminded them that true power lies in composure, not conflict. And Carson's stumble underscored the value of humility and growth, even when it comes at a cost. Together, they had created a moment that transcended the confines of late-night television, leaving behind a legacy far greater than either could have anticipated.